Okay, we are live.
We are.
From Mentionables TV, and the latest in the series of answering questions that no Christian can answer. These questions come from the Non Sequitur YouTube channel. And here's today's question.
There are thousands of other religions out there, many of which have millions of followers. So according to your logic and theirs, anyone who is a blasphemer to your particular deity is going to be condemned, whether it is to go to hell or to be reincarnated as a less intelligent animal. If your God is true, why is it that he would even allow the minds of humans to be so easily deceived into believing other religions? He essentially would have created brains that can be fooled and ultimately will send these people down to hell. In addition, how do you know you're not one of the people who have been fooled?
Okay, first off, these are questions for Christians, not Hindus. So why are we talking about reincarnation? Plus, many religions offer no concept of hell. But I digress. The real question here is, why does God allow people to be so deceived? So I only want to make 2 points with this for your consideration. Point 1, free will allows people to make the wrong choice. So, just as we are free to love, we are also free to choose evil. In that same vein, we are free to choose to believe whatever we want, whether that belief lines up with reality or not. So, even if it doesn't follow the evidence, we could still choose to believe something squarely because we want to. Point 2, this question assumes that deception is from God. Should this be our first assumption? Or instead, should we look at the most natural explanation first? Maybe we're self-deceptive, and our minds like to convince us of what we want to be true versus what lines up with reality. So just perhaps, the deception is our own and not God's. What I mean by that is that we often follow things that we may or may not find to be true, but we follow them because we want them to be true. Is it easier to believe that God exists, He cares for us, but in order for us to have that connection with Him, there's potential for an eternal consequence if we choose to reject that relationship? Or is it easier to believe that in essence we are our own gods and we get to decide whatever we want, including what is right and wrong with reality? One of those is certainly more appealing for a number of reasons. And I think we have to take some serious consideration as to whether we're self-deceiving before we place the blame on God.
Okay, so this objection that there's so many religions out there seems to be coming up a lot in this series. But this one's asking, well, why don't people just perceive God if God designed people? Why do people's minds get confused and misled so much? All right, so I'll accept that as a decent question, but let's think about this for a moment. If you go back far enough in human history, most of your religions are going to be polytheistic. This is an explanation for the world around us. So, we look at storm clouds and we think that, well, this must be God or a god. So, that's used to explain the thunder. God is used to explain the sun and various natural phenomena. But as we explore nature, we realize that these are more mechanical processes. They're not directed specifically by some kind of divine force. They're directed by natural forces, and so we get away from that. And as time goes on, you look at ancient polytheistic cultures like ancient Greece, and you have thinkers like Plato, and Plato migrates away from this idea of polytheism and starts to define God as the good. So now he realizes that there's some kind of universal force from which abstract properties flow, like the good or beauty. This is the aesthetic argument, or various things like that. And then you have Aristotle come on after Plato, and he's looking at this prime mover argument. He sees that everything in nature is change and that it's a chain of change, and he feels that this must go back to some kind of force or source that causes these potentials to become actuals within this changing universe. And so he decides that this force must be an unmoved mover, some kind of intentional force that doesn't change as a result of causing the movement of the universe. So it becomes more of a drawing force than an extensive force. And this can't possibly be some kind of polytheistic system with all kinds of gods interacting with each other, because they change as they interact. And he's talking about some kind of changeless being. So he migrates away from polytheism. Then you have like Zoroastrianism, where this gentleman in the Iranian area is looking at this polytheistic system and decides, you got to get rid of all these other gods, because, God becomes a source of good. So you've got good and evil, and he breaks it up into two gods. One is good, one is evil. But then you have people like Aquinas come along and say that, well, no, evil is just the lack of good. So just like darkness is a lack of light, evil is the lack of good. So as something becomes less good, has less goodness in it, that would be defined as evil. So evil isn't a force or a thing so much as the absence of order and good. And so the point is, what you have also Muhammad of the Muslims, who comes into a polytheistic system and decides that the thing that makes more sense would be monotheism. My point here is that as civilizations and religions mature, they move away from these polytheistic or pantheistic systems and start to look at monotheism. So as culture developed, as religion becomes more refined, it starts to look a lot like the Christian religion or the Judeo-Christian religion. So I would say that minds aren't necessarily designed to be deceived so much as they're designed to perceive. And much like how science progresses as we put more thought and knowledge into it, or philosophy progresses as we put more thought and knowledge into it, so religion progresses. Without even having the revelation of Scripture, for instance, here we have Aristotle and Plato coming up with a system that looks a lot like the Christian God. So are there many, many, many kinds of religions out there? Absolutely. Yes, there's lots of religions out there. As a matter of fact, I would be willing to say that there's not an articulate person on the planet or in history that has no idea what you're talking about when you start to talk about God. This idea of God is everywhere. It's universal. So people will possibly use that as an argument against God's existence by saying, well, humans are so naturally religious that explains the invention of God. But why is every human being so religious in nature? Why do we all have this kind of intuitive concept that, there is a force external to ourselves, that there's some kind of unembodied, disembodied mind in direction of the universe, that things have a purpose? It's just an intuitive idea. And where does this come from, if not from a designer that put this knowledge and this thought into our hearts so that we pursue this knowledge, and over time it becomes more mature? So yeah, I would say that God did not design minds to be deceived so much as to perceive. And just like science develops over time, so religion.
There are thousands of other religions with millions of followers who will be condemned. Why would God allow the minds of so many people to be easily deceived? He created brains that can be fooled and send people to hell. There's something going on here that I think isn't being considered, and that is that in order to consider that, or as you consider whether or not something is true, you have not only the available evidence, but you also have your standard of examining and judging whether or not that evidence supports the conclusion. So let's say you have an idea. Let's just call it idea, I, or X. X is the common one. Let's go with X. So you have idea or belief X. Well, you're going to have the evidence for X. Then you're going to have the way that you have determined that that evidence needs to be judged in order to claim whether or not X is actually true. It's not exactly breaking news to anyone that people can be unwilling, an act of the will, a choice, unwilling to acknowledge that something is true, regardless of there being obvious evidence to other people. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news and you see occasions of people who are making claims, commentators who are saying things that you're sitting there going, what are you talking about? Here's the evidence. Here's what's going on. How do you not see this? Right? It happens all the time. This is not exactly a new thing. Since there's been people, at least since Adam and Eve, after the garden, right? There have been people who get it wrong, who willingly get things wrong. There's such a thing as cognitive dissonance. There's such a thing as confirmation bias, right? These are acts of the will that say, I'm going to believe this and hold on to it. There's also this idea that how we examine the evidence actually matters, right? So the idea is, well, why does God let us be fooled, right? Did he give us faulty intelligences? No, he didn't. He gave us reasoning faculties. He gave us logic. He gave us the ability to reason, but he also gave us free will. So we have a choice in how this goes down, right? Mankind has a third step in the reasoning process that animals don't have. Right? And so you have stimulus and response. This happens, this conclusion. This happens, this action. But humans have that middle step. This happens, think about it. Okay, conclusion. Now it's right in here in this part where we get to insert our will, our choice to say, how am I going to examine and respond to this? How we reason about something is something that we choose to do or not do, as some cases are. For instance, there are plenty of people who believe in a notion that is commonly referred to as scientism, right? They believe that the only basis for true knowledge is scientific. That unless you can demonstrate something scientifically, you should not believe it's true. Well, the only problem with that is that notion itself cannot be scientifically demonstrated. How do you scientifically prove that you must scientifically prove something in order for it to be true? You can't. The whole idea itself just falls apart. It's called self-defeating. It's illogical. But there's still plenty of people that believe it. So here they have their faulty standard, an irrational, failed, self-defeating standard. But they still have it. They choose it, they like it, they keep it. For whatever reason, they have accepted it, and then they use that to view the evidence to determine if something is true. Well, if you've accepted a faulty standard, you're not going to come to right conclusions. So how do you know that you're not one of the people being fooled? Well, I don't. Maybe I am. Maybe I just completely got this whole thing wrong, right? But all I can do is all I can do. All I can do is what everyone else can do. And that's all any of us can do, is to take the best approach we can to make sure we have a good judge and standard of the evidence, that we try to eliminate as much bias as we can as we examine the evidence to determine what's true. If you stop and think about this idea that you should somehow doubt because, hey, maybe you're one that's been fooled, right? Hey, all these other people get it wrong. Maybe you got it wrong. Oh no, I need to stress and freak out and doubt about that. Well, you wouldn't be able to leave your house. If that was your default way of thinking, if you had such a hyper-skepticism about everything that you were questioning, maybe I'm wrong because other people disagree, you wouldn't be able to leave your house. Actually, probably wouldn't even have a house. You'd be institutionalized because you'd be so freaked out, anxious about everything all the time, you couldn't be a productive member of society and take care of yourself because you couldn't make any decisions. It's just not a rational way of approaching the world. How do you know you're not being fooled? Maybe I am being fooled, but I do what I can to try to eliminate my biases, look at the evidence, make sure I'm judging it correctly, and when I come to a conclusion, if I am convinced that my analysis method is correct, the evidence supports it, then I believe it. Because what else am I going to do? Everything points to it being true. So unless or until you can introduce new evidence or show me my standard is wrong, I have really no choice but to believe it. It's the same thing with Christ. Hey, you know what? There's these other people out there that believe something else. And if you think they're wrong, well, then they've been fooled. But if they've been fooled, how do you know you haven't been fooled? Because if you have no reason to doubt your method of examining the evidence, and you don't have any evidence to tell you you're wrong, that means what you're believing should be accepted as the truth. And so if you as a Christian, you're saying, hey, you know what? I've got this evidence for Christianity. I've got the Bible, which is reliable, and I've got my relationship with Christ, everything going on. And, as I'm looking at all this stuff, it means it's true. Well, there's these other people that have a different belief. Maybe they're the ones that are right and you're wrong. Well, maybe. But show it. Don't just claim it. Because right now, what I have says Christianity is true. And if you want that to be doubted, you need to bring something. And that's how we need to address it. That's how we need to view it. I believe this is true. Well, what about? Well, what about? What about doesn't actually get you anywhere. What you need to do is to say, no, okay, here is what I believe is true. Well, what about? No, not what about. Here's what I believe is true. You need to either find a way to correct my standard of judging the evidence, show me different evidence that leads to a different conclusion, or else I'm still finding this to be the case. This should not be a reason for a Christian to doubt. Well, other people believe things too. Yeah, they do. But why do you believe what you believe? Don't worry about what they believe and whether or not they've been fooled. Think about what you believe. Do you believe based on sound reasoning and good evidence? Well, yeah, I think so. Okay, then. Be secure in your belief.
Once again, Professor Stick, I'm sure you're swell, and I'd love to spend time answering this question for now the 4th time, but please just see questions 3, 5, and 7. The only twist you put is that it would be bad for God to send us to hell for that. So let me just clear up one misconception. We aren't sent to hell for having the wrong belief system. We're sent to hell because we're sinners who love our own sin and reject the sovereign creator that Romans tells us that we all know exists and the provision for salvation that he's provided in Jesus Christ. That is, we go to hell because we're guilty. Having wrong beliefs is just like icing on the cake. I'm not saved because I have correct beliefs. That would be works-based salvation. So once again, the pagan Pelagianism of the average atheist is just coming front and center here. So for the 4th time for this question, will it be the last? Sadly, no, it won't be.